Rome, 1951, held its winter evenings with a particular gentleness, as if the city understood that cold could be softened by stone walls and steady habits. In the narrow street, where lamplight pooled in pale ovals, shutters were already drawing closed like tired eyelids, and the last footsteps of the day were fading into the deeper hush that came after supper. Inside a modest apartment above a baker's shop, the air carried a faint sweetness of flour and yeast that rose through the floorboards, mingling with the clean, familiar scent of soap. The kitchen was small, but it was cared for in a way that made it feel generous. The table stood straight, its surface rubbed smooth by years of wiping, and the tiles along the wall caught the light and returned it softly, as if they too wanted to be helpful. Teresa Bellini moved through this room as though she had been made for it, or as though the room had been shaped around her pace. She was not old, not truly, but her calm had the depth of someone who had learned the value of doing small things well. Her dark hair was pinned back without fuss, and her sleeves were rolled to the forearm in a way that suggested she would rather work than talk about working. In the quiet of the kitchen, she seemed taller than she did in the street, perhaps because the space listened to her. Nothing here demanded speed. Nothing here asked for noise. Teresa did not hurry. She did not need to. There was time and there was order, and those two things, held together, made something like comfort. On the chair by the table lay a small bundle of stockings, folded and refolded until the pairs sat neatly against one another. Teresa's hands hovered over them with a steady tenderness, not sentimental, not dramatic, but attentive in the way a person might be attentive to a sleeping child. She lifted one stocking and let it drape from her fingers. The fabric was worn at the heel and patched in a careful oval, the stitches small and patient. It had belonged to her nephew when he was younger, before his feet seemed to grow overnight, before the world began asking him to be taller and louder. Now it waited for another kind of night, a night when the old stories were allowed to rest close to the everyday. In Rome, the Epiphany was not simply a date on the calendar. It was a familiar pause, a small turning of the season, and it carried with it the gentle figure of the Befana, an old woman of legend who, in the quiet hours before dawn, brought sweets to children who had been good and little reminders, sometimes made of coal, for those who had tested patience. Teresa did not speak the Befana's name aloud in the kitchen. She did not need to. Some things grew stronger when they were kept soft, yet her hands, and the calm sequence of her preparations, spoke for her. They said, "The night is coming, and we will be ready." They said, "There is a place for small joys, and we will make room." She crossed to the window first, not to look out, but to check the latch with the care of habit. The glass was cool under her fingertips. Beyond it, the street was a dim ribbon, and a bicycle leaned against a wall as if it had decided to sleep there. Teresa let her gaze rest for a moment on the closed shutters across the way, then returned to the room, carrying the quiet with her like a shawl. She touched the edge of the table, straightened a cloth that was already straight, and then came back to the stockings. A length of twine lay coiled on the counter, and beside it a few wooden pegs, smoothed by use. Teresa gathered the stockings in her arms and walked toward the hearth, where a simple line had been strung, clean and strong, from one hook to another. It was not a grand fireplace, but it held the memory of warmth. The stone around it was pale and worn, and in its shallow space there were a few pieces of kindling stacked like polite guests waiting to be introduced. Teresa reached up and pressed the line with her thumb to test its tension. It gave just enough, like a string on a well-tuned instrument. She nodded once, as if satisfied not only with the twine, but with the whole arrangement of the evening. She hung the first stocking at the left end, aligning its toe so it pointed slightly inward, as though it was listening. The peg clicked gently when it closed. The sound was small, but it mattered because it joined the room's quiet in a way that did not disturb it. Teresa stepped back, tilted her head, and adjusted the stocking by a finger's width. She did not do this because anyone would notice. She did it because she would notice. She did it because order was a kind of kindness, and the kitchen deserved kindness. Then she took the second stocking and repeated the gesture, spacing it evenly from the first. A third followed, and then a fourth. Each one hung with the same measured care, each one made to look as though it belonged precisely where it was. The line of stockings began to resemble something deliberate, almost ceremonial, though nothing about Teresa felt like a performer. Her movements were quiet and exact. She paused between each stocking, as if listening for a cue that came from somewhere beyond sound. In the stillness, the faint noises of the building were more noticeable. The low murmur of pipes, the settling of wood, the distant clink of a dish in another apartment. The world continued, but softly, as if it respected the work being done here. Teresa's thoughts did not rush either. They moved like her hands, calm and steady, drifting toward memories and then returning to the present without strain. She remembered being a girl and waking to the surprise of sweets tucked into fabric that had seemed empty at bedtime. She remembered the thrill of running her fingers inside the stocking and finding something wrapped, something meant for her. The memory was not sharp with excitement now. It was warm and gentle, like a candle behind glass. She did not ache for the past. She simply carried it, the way one carries a familiar recipe, and she offered it forward to those who came after. When the stockings were in place, Teresa smoothed her palms together as if brushing away invisible dust, then turned to the kitchen again. The room waited. It always seemed to wait, as though it understood that Teresa's routines were not only chores, but a kind of weaving. She wove quiet into the corners, steadiness into the air, readiness into the surfaces of things. The table was wiped already, the cups were stacked, the floor was swept, but there were always details to tend, small adjustments that made the whole room feel as though it could breathe evenly. She went to the cupboard and opened it without a creak. Inside, plates and bowls sat in tidy stacks. Teresa reached for a small saucer and held it up to the light, checking for a spot. There was none. She set it down on the table anyway, not yet in its final place, but as if beginning a gentle arrangement that would continue through the evening. Her fingers traced the edge of the saucer. The ceramic was cool and smooth. It reminded her of winter mornings when the first warmth of coffee could feel like a blessing. Teresa moved back to the stockings once more, drawn there as if by a quiet thread. She did not touch them this time. She simply looked. In their tidy line, they seemed to have a presence beyond cloth and stitching. They seemed patient. They seemed hopeful. The room around them felt subtly altered, as if the simple act of hanging them had shifted the air into something more tender. It was not that Teresa expected a door to open or a shadow to cross the floor. The Befana was not like that in Teresa's mind. The Befana was not a spectacle. She was a feeling. She was the hush that fell when a house was made ready. She was the gentle joy that came from knowing, without needing proof, that care could be answered by care. From the hallway came the faint sound of a radio in a neighbor's apartment, a melody softened by distance and walls. Teresa listened for a moment, letting it pass through her like a breeze. She did not follow it with thought. She simply allowed it to be part of the night's texture. Then she returned to her own sounds. The quiet click of a cupboard closing, the soft whisper of her slippers on tile, the subtle rustle of fabric as she reached for a cloth. The kitchen seemed to settle further, like a blanket pulled smoothly over a bed. At the table, Teresa placed the saucer in the center and aligned it with the grain of the wood. She rested her hand flat on the tabletop and felt the steadiness of it. There was something satisfying in the way the surface held her palm. It did not demand anything. It simply supported. Teresa breathed in, slow and even. The air tasted faintly of flour and soap and the cool hint of night. She looked once more toward the line of stockings, and in her chest, somewhere behind the ribs, there was a quiet sense of rightness, as if she had placed the evening where it belonged. She continued with the next small task, already moving into the gentle sequence that would carry her through the rest of the night. But for this moment, the stockings hung in their tidy line, waiting without impatience, and the kitchen held its calm like a carefully tended flame after the stockings were hung and the room had accepted their presence. Teresa allowed herself a moment of stillness that did not feel like stopping, but like listening. The kitchen seemed to hold its breath in a gentle way, as if it had become aware of the quiet ceremony and wanted to keep it intact. Outside, Rome settled deeper into evening, the street sounds thinning until they were only small, occasional threads. A distant door closing, a few soft voices, the faint roll of a cart somewhere far along the stones. Inside, the light from the single lamp softened the edges of everything it touched, turning the tiles pale and friendly, and making the worn tabletop look almost honeyed. Teresa's hands moved again, guided by a rhythm she did not have to think about, because it lived inside her like a well-known song. On the counter, she had arranged her materials earlier, not in a pile, but in a careful layout that made each thing easy to find. There were sheets of plain paper cut into neat rectangles, a coil of twine with its end tucked under itself, and a small dish of sweets waiting with quiet patience. The candies were simple, the sort that could be bought without extravagance. Small drops of sugar glazed with faint color, a few wrapped caramels, and little almond bites that carried a scent like sunlight caught in a jar. Teresa did not need the sweets to be rare. She only needed them to be chosen with care. In this house, care was what made ordinary things feel touched by something more. She drew a chair closer to the table and sat, not with the slump of fatigue, but with the composed ease of someone settling into a familiar task. The paper made a soft sound as she lifted the first rectangle, a whispering scrape that seemed almost polite. She placed a sweet at the center and folded one edge over, then the other, smoothing the seam with the pad of her thumb until it lay flat. The motion was unhurried and precise. Her fingers knew how to press without tearing, how to crease without cracking. She turned the little parcel once, checked the corners, and adjusted a fold so the shape looked clean and complete. Teresa reached for the twine. She did not cut long lengths. She cut only what she needed, as if respecting both the material and the task. The twine was rough enough to hold a knot, but not so rough that it scratched. She looped it around the parcel, crossed it underneath, and brought it back up, tying a simple bow that sat neatly in the center. The knot tightened with a faint, satisfying pull. She trimmed the ends to match. Then she set the wrapped sweet to one side, where a small row began to form like a tiny procession. Each one looked modest, but together they seemed to carry a quiet promise. As she worked, Teresa's thoughts moved in a slow, steady current. She did not daydream in the way of someone escaping. She remembered, gently, and she considered gently, and she returned always to what was in her hands. She thought of the children who would wake tomorrow. Her nephew, Marco, would pretend not to be excited because he was nearly 12 and believed that excitement belonged to younger boys. Yet Teresa could already imagine his eyes finding the stockings before he could stop himself. Her niece, little Sophia, was still young enough to accept wonder without apology. She would stand in her nightshirt, with her hair in a tumble, holding her breath as she reached inside the fabric, as if the stocking might contain not only sweets, but the very feeling of being cared for. Teresa did not live with the children. They were her sisters, living a short walk away, and on nights like this, they would come over early, fill the kitchen with soft chatter and warmth, and then go home again, tucked into their own beds. Teresa's apartment would be quiet after they left, yet not empty. It would hold the echo of their voices, and it would hold the preparations she had made, and those things were enough. She did not need a crowd to feel that life was full. She had learned to find fullness in the way a cup was placed on a saucer, in the way a cloth folded cleanly, in the way a room could be made ready for morning. She wrapped another sweet, then another. The row of parcels grew. The paper was plain, but Teresa's hands gave it a sort of dignity. Each parcel felt like a small secret, something meant to be discovered. She noticed how the twine looked against the paper, how the knot made a tiny shadow beneath the lamp. These details pleased her, not because she wanted perfection in a harsh sense, but because she loved the sense of order that allowed the mind to rest. When things were arranged well, the room felt calm, and when the room felt calm, it seemed to invite a gentler kind of night. From time to time, she paused to straighten the stack of unused paper, aligning the edges, or to coil the twine so it did not sprawl. These small gestures were part of her pattern, as natural as breathing. Her movements kept the kitchen tidy, not only in appearance, but in spirit. She believed, though she rarely would have said it out loud, that a tidy space could hold warmth longer. It could keep worries from settling, the way dust settled. It could make room for quiet joy to enter without being jostled. When she had wrapped a dozen sweets, she reached for a small tin that sat on the shelf above the stove. It was an old tin, once used for biscuits, with a faded illustration on the lid and a slight dent on one side where it had been dropped years ago. Teresa opened it and took out a few pieces of dark, irregular candy, hard sugar cooked until it held a deeper flavor, almost like burnt honey. She liked these best, though she would never claim them as her own. She wrapped them with the same care, knowing that Marco would choose one immediately and make a face at its seriousness, then take another, pretending he did not like it, and yet returning to it anyway. She worked until the table held a small, orderly heap of parcels. Then, as if to complete the thought, she gathered them in her hands and walked to the line of stockings. The fabric hung quietly, their toes still pointing slightly inward, their bodies gently curved with emptiness waiting to be filled. Teresa stood close enough to smell the faint, clean scent of laundry soap in the cloth. She slid one hand into the first stocking and felt the familiar stretch. Her fingers brushed the patched heel. The fabric was cool and soft. She placed 2 parcels into each stocking, letting them settle toward the bottom. The paper made a faint rustle as it slid along the fabric. The twine caught briefly and then released, as if the stocking was learning how to hold its gifts. Teresa did not overfill them. She wanted the stockings to feel light, not heavy. She wanted the children to discover a few things, not be overwhelmed. There was a difference, she believed, between abundance that clattered and abundance that soothed. She favored the kind that soothed. After she placed the parcels, she adjusted the stockings again, not because they had moved much, but because she liked the feeling of setting them right. The pegs held firm. The line remained straight. The stockings now had a slight weight, a gentle sag that made them look more alive. Teresa stepped back and looked at them. The sight pleased her. It was simple. It was enough. She returned to the table and began to tidy the wrapping area, stacking the remaining paper, winding the twine into its coil, brushing away a few grains of sugar that had fallen like tiny stars. The work of clearing was as soothing as the work of making. It brought the kitchen back to its clean state, ready for the next part of the evening's pattern. Teresa's hands moved steadily, and her mind remained quiet, not empty, but calm and settled. The sense of the Befana, that old presence of winter tradition, did not arrive with any sudden sign. It simply seemed to deepen in the room, as if the careful wrapping and the neat knots were a kind of invitation. Teresa washed her hands at the sink, the water running warm over her fingers. She dried them on a cloth that hung by the window, then folded the cloth neatly and returned it to its hook. Each action had its own place, its own completion. In the gentle order of these tasks, the night felt less like something to endure and more like something to inhabit. Teresa's eyes moved once more to the stockings, now holding their small, secret parcels. And for a moment, she imagined the quiet path of the Befana through the city, not as a figure on a broom, but as a feeling passing from home to home, settling wherever care had been laid down like a soft cloth. She did not linger on the image. She did not need to. The kitchen itself was telling the story. It told it in the tidy line of stockings, in the wrapped sweets tied with twine, in the clean table waiting patiently for what would come next. Teresa turned back toward the stove, where the kettle waited, unheated, like a small sleeping thing. Her hand hovered near it, already moving toward the next familiar step, and the evening continued, steady and quiet, as the city outside grew darker and the home inside grew more ready. Teresa's hand settled on the kettle as if greeting something familiar and dependable, and the metal, cool at first, seemed to accept the warmth of her palm without complaint. The kettle was not new. Its handle had been held by many evenings, and its sides bore a soft dullness that came from years of use and gentle scrubbing. It sat on the stove like a quiet companion, waiting to be asked into service. Teresa lifted it, carried it to the sink, and turned the tap with the same careful pressure she used for everything else, neither too fast nor too slow. Water filled the kettle with a steady sound, clear and unbroken, a small river contained. She watched the rising level for a moment, attentive to the simple truth of it, then shut off the water and let the last drops fall in their own time. When she set the kettle on the burner, the base met the iron ring with a soft, familiar clink. She adjusted it so it sat perfectly centered, as if the kettle deserved to rest in balance. Then she reached for a match. Her matchbox lay in a small dish on the counter, where it always lay, kept dry and orderly. She struck the match once, and the brief flare of flame lit her fingers in warm gold. She held it to the gas, and the burner answered with a gentle, steady blue. The match was shaken out, placed carefully in the dish, and then the kitchen returned to its usual light, as if nothing dramatic had happened at all. For a moment, there was only the quiet of water beginning to warm, a silence that felt alive rather than empty. Teresa stood close enough to hear the earliest signs, the barely there shifting inside the kettle. It was not yet the song people thought of when they imagined a boiling kettle. It was smaller. It was a whisper. The water was waking, stretching, settling into warmth. The sound was like breath behind a door. Teresa listened as if it mattered, because to her it did. It meant the evening had moved forward into the next step, and the next step was always a comfort, because it was known. She turned from the stove and crossed to the cupboard where her cups were kept. The cupboard door opened smoothly, and the cups inside sat in a neat row, handles turned in the same direction. Teresa chose two, not because she expected company now, but because she liked the feeling of readiness, and because a second cup made the table look more complete. The porcelain was simple, cream-colored with a thin line of faded blue near the rim. She held one cup near her face for a moment, not to inspect it for cleanliness. She already knew it was clean, but to breathe in the faint scent of ceramic, the almost invisible memory of coffee and tea that had passed through it. Then she carried both cups to the table and placed them down with care. She added saucers, aligning them so the rims were parallel to the table's edge. She placed spoons on each saucer, the handles pointing outward like small invitations. These gestures were quiet, but they made the room feel more settled. They suggested that warmth would be poured soon, that hands might wrap around cups, that the night could hold comfort in its center. The kettle behind her continued its first soft whispering, and the stove flame remained steady, as patient as Teresa herself. She went back to the counter and took out a small tin of sugar. The lid came off without a scrape. The sugar inside was fine and pale. Teresa did not spoon it into the cups yet, but she set the tin on the table, placed beside it a little ceramic bowl where she sometimes kept lemon slices when she had them. Tonight, there were no lemons. It did not matter. The bowl, empty, still had its place. There was something soothing about a complete arrangement, even if not every piece was used. As she moved, Teresa's mind drifted toward the winter that lay over the city and the way Rome handled cold. The buildings held warmth the way thick blankets held warmth. Stone walls kept the day's heat longer, releasing it slowly, and in small kitchens like hers, the stove and kettle added their gentle help. Outside, people walked briskly, scarves pulled high, but inside, evenings could feel almost tender. Teresa thought of the baker downstairs, who would rise long before dawn to shape dough and feed his ovens. The smell of his bread, even now, was faintly present, a quiet assurance that morning would come and bring its own comforts. The kettle's whisper grew a little louder. Teresa returned to the stove and placed her fingertips lightly on the kettle's side, feeling the first suggestion of warmth through the metal. She withdrew her hand and smiled, not broadly, not with display, but with the smallest softening at the corners of her mouth. It pleased her when things did what they were meant to do. It pleased her when water became warm, when cups waited, when the kitchen held order. These were not grand triumphs, yet they made life feel reliable. She reached for a cloth and wiped the counter once, even though it was already clean. The motion was slow, rhythmic, as if she were smoothing a surface inside herself as well. The cloth moved in a steady line. She folded it and set it down. Then she opened a drawer and took out a small jar of dried chamomile. The flowers were pale and delicate, each one holding its own quiet scent. Teresa poured a small measure into a tea infuser, the dried petals falling with a soft, dry sound. She held the infuser above the cup, letting it hover for a moment, as if the cup could sense what was coming, then set it down beside the saucer, ready. Behind her, the water warmed further. The whispering deepened into a low murmur. It was still gentle, still restrained, but it had a clear direction now. It was moving towards song. Teresa enjoyed this stage most, the stage when the kettle was not yet demanding attention, but was clearly becoming. It felt like watching dawn approach, not sudden, but sure. She glanced at the stockings again, hanging in their tidy line. The small wrapped sweets inside made them droop slightly, and the sight added another layer of quiet pleasure to the room. The evening's preparations were gathering like a soft quilt, each piece adding warmth. Teresa sat again at the table, not because she was tired, but because she liked to be near her work. She rested her hands lightly on the tabletop and listened. The kettle's sounds joined the other small sounds of the building. A neighbor's muffled footsteps, a door closing gently, the distant hum of someone's radio fading away. Rome was never completely silent, even at night, but it could become quiet in the way a church became quiet, filled with presence rather than noise. Teresa felt that presence now, and it comforted her. Her thoughts returned, without strain, to the Befana. She did not imagine her as a figure bursting into rooms, leaving chaos behind. She imagined her as something like the kettle's whisper, beginning small, almost unnoticed, growing through steady warmth until it became a song felt in the bones. The Befana, in Teresa's mind, lived in preparations, in the careful tying of twine, in the tidiness of stockings, in the way a home was made ready for children's morning delight. The Befana was not an interruption. She was the gentle continuation of order, the invisible friend of quiet routines. When the kettle began to sigh, Teresa rose. The sound was clearer now, a soft exhale that suggested steam gathering inside. She lifted the kettle's lid slightly and peered in, not too close. A faint mist rose, and the air above the opening was warm against her face. She replaced the lid. The kettle continued, and now the whisper was turning into a steady, soothing hiss. Teresa returned to the cups and placed the infuser in one of them. In the other, she set a spoonful of ground coffee into a small metal filter, preparing it for later, though she knew she might not drink coffee tonight. It was simply comforting to have it ready, to know the morning could begin easily. She placed everything in its place, adjusted a spoon so it lay straight, and breathed in. The scent of chamomile was faint, but calming. The kitchen felt like a small sanctuary built from simple actions. The kettle's song grew. It was not sharp, not impatient. It was a steady rising note, as if the water had finally found its voice. Teresa watched the flame under the kettle, saw how even it was, how it held the heat without flickering wildly. She loved the steadiness of it. She loved how a small blue flame could transform cold water into something that could warm hands and soothe a throat. The transformation felt quietly magical, not because it defied nature, but because nature itself was generous when met with attention. At last, the kettle reached the edge of a full boil. The sound became more pronounced, a clear, rounded note that filled the kitchen without overwhelming it. Teresa turned the flame down slightly, not wanting the water to rage. She wanted it hot, not frantic. She lifted the kettle by its handle, careful but confident, and carried it to the table. A thin ribbon of steam followed, drifting upward like a ghost of warmth. Teresa poured slowly into the cup with chamomile, the water catching the dried flowers and releasing their scent immediately, a soft bloom rising into the air. She poured a smaller amount into the second cup, not as a drink, but to warm the porcelain, then set it aside again, ready for whatever the night asked of her next. She sat down, cradled the first cup in her hands, and let the warmth seep into her palms. The kitchen seemed to settle further, as if it had been waiting for this moment. The stockings hung quietly. The parcels of sweets rested in their paper and twine. The kettle, now silent, sat on its trivet like a finished thought. Teresa sipped once, and the chamomile was gentle, a flavor that asked nothing. The warmth traveled slowly through her, and she felt the evening deepen into something steady and kind, as though the house itself were beginning to hum with readiness, preparing to hold the night in a calm embrace. The chamomile warmed Teresa from the inside in a slow, patient way, as though it knew that true comfort did not rush. She held the cup with both hands and let her fingers rest against the porcelain, feeling the gentle heat gather in her palms. The kitchen lamp cast a calm circle of light across the table, leaving the corners of the room dim but not uneasy. And in that soft half-shadow, the world seemed simpler. Teresa took another sip, then set the cup down and listened to the quiet that followed, the kind of quiet that did not feel like absence, but like a careful pause between one soothing thought and the next. When she rose, it was with the same ease she brought to everything, and she began to arrange the table as if she were laying out small pieces of moonlight. Cups and saucers in her mind belonged to a gentle order that could make even a plain kitchen feel like a place prepared for grace. She picked up the second cup, the one she had warmed, and poured the water out into the sink, watching the thin stream disappear without sound. Then she dried the cup's rim with a cloth, not because it needed it, but because she liked the final touch of dryness, the neatness of a clean edge. She set it back on its saucer and turned the handle slightly so it matched the angle of the first cup. The two cups sat side by side like quiet companions. Teresa's eyes moved over the table, seeking balance. She drew the sugar tin a little closer, then shifted it back, finding the place where it looked settled. She placed a small spoon beside it, the handle aligned with the grain of the wood, as if the table itself had lines meant to guide her. She moved the empty bowl, the one that might have held lemon slices, to the far side, so it did not look forgotten, but simply waiting. She smoothed the tablecloth, though it was hardly more than a runner, pressing out a wrinkle with the flat of her hand. The cloth yielded and lay flat, and the table seemed to brighten under her touch. She did not think of this as fussing. Teresa did not feel anxious about the arrangement. It was the opposite of anxiety. It was a slow and calming kind of attention, like brushing hair until it lay smooth, or folding a blanket until it looked ready to offer warmth. The table, in its neatness, felt like a promise that the morning could begin without struggle. It also felt like a quiet welcome, a wordless message to the night itself. Here, things are cared for. She walked to the cupboard again and opened it. Inside, the dishes rested in orderly stacks, the edges of plates forming clean lines. Teresa chose a small plate with a faint floral pattern near the rim and brought it to the table. On it, she placed two simple biscuits, round and pale, the sort that softened easily in tea. She did not know if anyone would eat them tonight. It did not matter. Their presence made the setting feel complete. She remembered how, as a child, she loved the look of a table prepared for warmth, even if she did not sit at it for long. It made her feel safe, as if there would always be something ready when she needed it. The kettle sat on the trivet now, silent and content, and a faint warmth still rose from it. Teresa's eyes traveled from the kettle to the stockings on the line. Their tidy row looked almost like a string of small, sleeping creatures, each one holding its secret parcels. The room seemed to breathe evenly. Teresa felt, without needing to name it, that the sense of the Befana had grown, not in a way that made the hairs on her arms lift, not in a way that turned the air strange. It was subtler. It was like the feeling that comes when a bed has been freshly made and the sheets are smooth, when the night ahead seems gentle. The Befana, for Teresa, was simply the spirit of such readiness, She returned to the table and adjusted the spoons again. A fraction of movement, a small improvement. The metal caught the light briefly and then settled into stillness. She took the cloth from the chair and folded it into a square, creasing it carefully. She placed it beside the cups, like a quiet finishing note. The table looked simple, but it held a kind of soft dignity, as if the kitchen were offering comfort without needing applause. From outside came a faint sound of footsteps on stone, then a quiet murmur of voices that drifted away. Teresa imagined a couple passing beneath her window, scarves pulled close, perhaps carrying a small bundle, perhaps returning from visiting family. Rome, even in winter, held itself with warmth. The city was old enough to know that cold nights were temporary, that the sun returned, and that people could make their own small seasons of comfort indoors. Teresa felt herself part of that larger rhythm. Her kitchen was a small place, but it belonged to the city's great tapestry of rooms where lamps glowed and kettles warmed, and hands folded cloth. She moved to the sink and rinsed the chamomile infuser, setting it on a small dish to dry. The dish was white, and she placed it exactly where it always went, near the window where a faint draft kept things fresh. She dried her hands, folded the towel, and hung it straight. Every motion seemed to settle the air further. The kitchen became not only tidy but calm, as if order itself were a kind of lullaby. Teresa returned to the table and sat again, this time without the cup in her hands. She simply sat and looked at what she had arranged. It might have seemed too careful to some, too exact, but to Teresa it was a form of gentleness. The world outside could be unpredictable. People could be hurried, money could be thin, news could be heavy. Yet here, in this room, she could create steadiness. She could make a small island of calm. The table, with its cups and saucers, its sugar tin and biscuits, felt like proof that calm could be built with simple things. Her eyes lingered on the cups. Under the lamp's light, their curved rims seemed to glow softly, as if holding a pale reflection of the moon, even though the moon itself was hidden behind the city's roofs. Teresa thought, briefly, of how her mother had arranged cups on winter nights, always turning handles the same way, always wiping the rims, always placing the sugar spoon beside the tin as if it belonged there by law. Teresa had once teased her mother for it, gently, in the way daughters do. Her mother had only smiled and said that a tidy table made the morning kinder. At the time, Teresa had not understood. Now she did, not as an abstract idea, but as something she could feel in her bones. The kitchen's quiet seemed to deepen, and with it came a soft kind of alertness, not anxiety, but attentiveness. Teresa felt as if the room were listening with her. She glanced once more at the stockings, then back at the table. The connection between them felt natural. Stockings for morning delight, cups for evening warmth. Both were forms of readiness. Both were ways of caring for those she loved, even when they were not present. She rose again, not because she was restless, but because the evening's rhythm carried her forward. She moved the chair back neatly, pushing it in so it lined up with the table. She took the biscuit plate and shifted it a little to the left, so it centered between the cups. The movement was tiny, yet it satisfied her. The table now looked balanced, like a quiet, still life painted with attention and patience. At last, Teresa stepped away, allowing the table to rest in its prepared state, untouched for the moment. She crossed to the window and looked out briefly, not searching for anything, simply acknowledging the night. The street below was darker now, the lamps casting longer shadows. The air on the other side of the glass looked cold, but clean. Teresa touched the curtain's edge, then let it fall back into place. She turned and looked at her kitchen. the cups waiting like moonlit stones, the stockings hanging in their tidy line, the kettle resting, the surfaces clean and ready. The room felt held, as if it had been gently set aside for the night, not abandoned, but cared for. Teresa's breathing remained slow and even. She felt a quiet satisfaction, not pride, but the simple ease of knowing she had made things ready. The unseen Befana, if she were anywhere, was here in this calm order, in the unhurried attention, in the way the kitchen seemed to glow softly from within. Teresa did not seek more signs. She did not need them. The preparation itself was the presence, the quiet joy of order settling into place, and it carried her into the next gentle task as the night continued to deepen. The table, now set with its quiet symmetry, seemed to give the kitchen a gentle center, and Teresa felt the evening's steadiness gather around it like a shawl. She moved without hurry toward the counter where a loaf of bread rested, still faintly warm beneath its simple crust. She had bought it earlier from the baker downstairs, timing her visit so it would be fresh from the oven, the way she always did when winter nights felt long, and she wanted the apartment to hold an extra breath of comfort. Even now, hours later, the bread kept a little warmth in its heart, as if reluctant to release it to the cold season outside. The loaf sat on a wooden board, its surface dusted with flour that looked pale in the lamplight. Teresa placed her hand lightly on the crust and felt the remaining warmth, subtle but real, rising into her palm. It was a familiar sensation, one she associated with safety and with mornings that began kindly. Bread was never merely food to her. It was a steady companion, a quiet promise that simple nourishment would be there when needed. She leaned in and breathed the scent, yeast, grain, the faint sweetness of browned crust, and the smell seemed to soften the whole room, as if the kitchen were remembering other winters, other nights, other loaves carried home in paper. Teresa reached for a clean cloth, a linen one folded neatly in the drawer. She chose it carefully, not because she lacked cloths, but because she liked using the best one for this task. The linen was smooth and cool, its weave tight and even. She unfolded it slowly, letting it open like a small sail catching gentle air. Then she draped it over the loaf, tucking the edges around the board so the bread sat snugly beneath, protected from drafts, allowed to rest as though it were something living that deserved care. The cloth fell softly, and the loaf disappeared from view, but its presence remained in the faint warmth that continued to rise, and in the scent that lingered. For a moment, Teresa stood there with her hands resting on the edge of the board, as if the simple act of covering bread had completed something inside her. The evening felt quieter still. The room seemed to understand that the bread was meant for morning, that it was part of the gentle continuity she was building. Warm bread under a clean cloth was not an extravagant gesture. It was ordinary. Yet in its ordinariness, it carried a kind of magic, the kind that belonged to homes rather than stories. Teresa thought of the Befana again, not as a figure who would swoop in with a dramatic rustle, but as a quiet presence that favored such preparations. The Befana, in Teresa's private sense, would notice a loaf kept warm. She would approve of a clean cloth and a tidy board. She would settle into a room that respected small comforts. Teresa turned toward the stove and checked the kettle, though it no longer sang. Its surface still held a faint heat, and the air above it carried the softest trace of chamomile. She took the kettle's lid in her fingers, lifted it slightly, and saw that a little steam still lived inside, a gentle ghost of warmth. She set the lid down again. Nothing needed changing. It was enough to notice, to confirm that the warmth was still there, and then to let it be. The kitchen did not demand constant action. It asked only for steady attention. She crossed back to the table and smoothed the cloth runner again, a small gesture that felt like patting a blanket into place. Her eyes lingered on the cups and saucers, the biscuits on their plate. The sugar tin settled like a quiet anchor. Everything looked ready, not for a grand event, but for the kind of simple comfort that could make a winter night feel less long. Teresa's gaze drifted from the table to the stockings. Their tidy line seemed to form a gentle horizon across the hearth. Beneath the fabric, the wrapped sweets sat silent, waiting to be discovered. The stockings did not look heavy, only softly filled, as though they held dreams rather than objects. A faint draft brushed the back of Teresa's neck, reminding her of the window. She turned and walked toward it, not in haste, but with the same calm precision she gave to every task. The curtain stirred slightly, and she laid her hand on the fabric, feeling its coolness. The night outside pressed against the glass. Teresa traced the edge of the window frame with her fingertips, checking again that it was properly closed. It was. Still, she adjusted the curtain so it fell evenly, minimizing the draft. Small comforts mattered. Even a thin current of cold could disturb the quiet warmth she had built. Returning to the counter, Teresa took out a small knife and a cutting board, then paused. She did not cut the bread yet. She imagined the morning. Sophia's small hands reaching toward the loaf. Marco's half-embarrassed hunger. The way children could wake with appetite and expectation woven together. Bread would be part of that morning, and it deserved to be left intact until it was needed. Cutting it now would expose the soft interior to air and dryness. Teresa set the knife back in its place. She placed the cutting board away. The bread remained under its cloth, waiting. She rinsed her hands again, more from habit than necessity, and dried them carefully. The sound of the cloth against her fingers was soft. The kitchen was full of such sounds, small, gentle, almost whispered, and they formed a kind of music, a lullaby made of routine. Teresa moved to the cupboard and checked the jars on the shelf. Flour in one, coffee in another, sugar in its tin, a small jar of jam placed near the front. The jam was fig, dark and sweet. She touched the jar's lid lightly, as if acknowledging its presence. Jam and bread, tea and biscuits, stockings and sweets. These were modest offerings, yet together they formed a kind of abundance that did not shout. Teresa thought, briefly, of how some people believed magic had to be loud. They wanted sparks and signs, sudden changes in the air. Teresa had never been drawn to that sort of wonder. The wonder she trusted was the kind that lived in repetition, in quiet care. If the Befana came, she would come into this sort of room. She would step softly, unseen, through calm shadows, and she would feel welcomed not by noise, but by readiness. Teresa could almost sense it now, not as a presence standing in the corner, but as a softness settling into the arrangement of things. A clean cloth on warm bread felt like a greeting offered to the night. She returned to the table and sat again, folding her hands loosely in her lap. The chair was sturdy, its wood worn smooth at the edges. The lamp's light made the cups shine gently. Teresa let her gaze drift, not fixating, simply taking in the room. Her breathing remained slow. She felt herself anchored in the quiet. Outside, Rome continued to turn through the night, but inside, time seemed to move differently. It moved at her pace, measured and calm, as if the kitchen itself agreed that this evening belonged to steadiness. In her mind, Teresa pictured the bread beneath its cloth. She pictured the warmth held inside, the crust keeping its secrets. There was something comforting about that hidden warmth, as if the loaf carried a small sun within it. She imagined the morning when the cloth would be lifted and the scent would rise again, fresh and welcoming, and the children would lean in instinctively, drawn by hunger and familiarity. Teresa liked preparing for mornings. She liked the way a morning could be softened before it even arrived, simply by arranging things the night before. It made the future feel less sharp, less demanding. Her eyes returned to the stockings once more, and she noticed how the line of them, combined with the table's order and the bread's quiet resting, made the kitchen look as though it were holding a gentle secret. The secret was not an object. It was a feeling that care could be offered quietly, that the night could be approached without fear, that morning could be invited with kindness. The kitchen, in its tidy state, seemed to glow from within, not brightly, but warmly, like embers covered by ash. Teresa rose again, as if the evening's rhythm had tapped her shoulder. She walked to the shelf where she kept a small broom, a simple one with a wooden handle and straw bristles bound tightly at the base. It leaned there, neat and ready, and Teresa's hand rested on the handle for a moment. She did not lift it yet. She simply touched it, as if acknowledging that another small task waited, another quiet step in the gentle sequence. The bread was warm beneath its clean cloth. The table was set. The stockings held their parcels, and the kitchen was ready to continue its slow pattern into the deeper part of night. Teresa's fingers curled around the broom handle with a calm familiarity, and the wood, worn smooth by years of use, felt almost warm beneath her touch. She drew it from its resting place beside the shelf and held it upright for a moment, not as though preparing for labor, but as though acknowledging an old companion. In the gentle order of her kitchen, even the broom had a dignity. It was not merely a tool to chase dust. It was part of the quiet language of readiness, the way a folded cloth or a set cup could speak without sound. Teresa carried it toward the doorway that led into the narrow corridor of her apartment, her slippers making the faintest whisper on the tile. The doorway itself was simple, framed in pale plaster, and the corridor beyond it was dimmer than the kitchen, lit only by the spill of lamplight. Teresa paused at the threshold and looked down, as if the floor were asking for a final smoothing. The apartment was clean. She had swept earlier. Still, she liked the ritual of gathering the day's last crumbs, the faint dust that seemed to appear even in the quietest home, as if brought in by the very act of living. She swept lightly, not with brisk strokes that raised air and noise, but with slow, careful movements that drew small, invisible particles into gentle lines. The bristles whispered against the floor, a soft sound like dry grass moving in a breeze. Teresa's shoulders stayed relaxed. Her breathing stayed even. She did not think of sweeping as a burden. She thought of it as settling. When she finished, she carried the broom back toward the kitchen door, and there, beside the frame, she placed it carefully, leaning it at a slight angle that pleased her eye. She adjusted it by a few centimeters, then stepped back to observe. The broom rested as if it had always belonged there, neither in the way nor hidden away. It looked ready, as though it could be lifted at any moment if needed, yet it also looked finished, content to stand quietly through the night. Teresa's gaze lingered, and she felt a soft satisfaction, not because the broom was beautiful, but because its placement made sense. Order to her was not strictness. It was harmony. There was an old belief she had absorbed without being taught, the kind that seeped into a person through overheard conversations and winter traditions. People said the Befana liked a tidy home. People said she was an old woman who swept the floor as she passed, leaving behind not only sweets, but a sense of cleanliness, as if she tidied the world while she delivered her gifts. Teresa did not know if this belief was true in any literal sense, and she did not feel the need to test it. Yet she liked the thought that sweeping and tidiness were part of the story, that cleanliness was not only practical, but quietly sacred. The broom by the door, resting in its proper place, felt like a respectful nod to that old tale. She returned to the table and glanced at the cups again, at the bread covered beneath its clean cloth. The kitchen held its calm, and now, with the broom in view near the doorway, the room seemed even more prepared, as if it had tightened the last loose thread. Teresa took up the cloth she had used earlier and wiped the edge of the counter once more, then folded the cloth into a neat square and placed it in its drawer. She did this slowly, the way one might close a book carefully after reading something comforting. Then she closed the drawer. The soft click of it sounded final in a gentle way. The apartment's quiet was deepening. Outside, the street noises had thinned into almost nothing. Even the building seemed to settle, pipes cooling, floorboards resting. Teresa could hear her own movements more clearly now. The slight creak of the chair as she shifted it, the faint rustle of her skirt, the subtle sound of her breath. These small sounds did not disturb her. They made her feel present, anchored in her home. She looked at the broom again and imagined it as a small sentinel, a symbol of readiness at the threshold between rooms. It was an ordinary object, but in this night of tradition and quiet expectation, ordinary objects carried more meaning. She walked to the sink and poured out the last of her chamomile, then rinsed the cup and saucer, not wanting them to sit with residue. The water ran softly, and she washed with careful circles, as if polishing away the day. She dried the cup with a towel and placed it back on its saucer, returning it to the table where it had been, as though restoring the room's calm arrangement. She washed the second cup as well, even though it had only been warmed. She liked finishing things completely. Then she returned the cups to the cupboard, setting them back in their row, handles turned neatly. The cupboard door closed without complaint. Teresa's hands were now free, and she stood in the center of the kitchen for a moment, simply feeling the room. The lamp's light seemed softer, as if it had grown tired. Shadows lay gently in the corners. The stockings hung in their tidy line, holding their small parcels. The bread rested beneath its cloth, keeping its warmth. The broom stood by the door in its precise angle, quiet and ready. Teresa felt, more strongly now, that the unseen Befana was not a visitor who arrived suddenly, but a presence that gathered through such preparations. It was the sense that the night was being welcomed properly, that the home was being made smooth and kind, not only for children's morning delight, but for sleep itself. She moved toward the window again, then stopped. There was no need yet to close the shutters. That would come later, the final step. For now, she wanted the kitchen to hold its gentle glow a little longer. She sat at the table once more, resting her forearms lightly on the wood. The table's surface was warm from the lamp and from her earlier touch. Teresa let her mind drift to the day behind her, not with worry, but with the calm review of someone who enjoyed noticing small moments. She had spoken with her sister earlier, had heard Sophia's laughter through the open doorway, had watched Marco try to appear indifferent while still accepting a biscuit. These memories were simple, but they filled her with a quiet contentment. They reminded her that tenderness did not have to be grand. It could be offered in small daily gestures. The broom by the door seemed to embody that idea. It was a tool for keeping the floor clean, yes, but it also suggested that the house was cared for, that it was not left to drift into disorder. Teresa believed that a cared-for home could cradle the mind more gently. When a room was tidy, the thoughts inside it could loosen, could stop gripping so tightly. The body could rest. The heart could soften. The night could become a place of ease. She rose again, almost reluctantly, and walked to the hearth. The kindling stacked there remained untouched, neat and dry. Teresa did not light a fire tonight. The stove's warmth and the bread's lingering heat were enough, and the apartment was not so cold. She placed her hand near the hearthstones, feeling the faint coolness, and then withdrew it. The room did not need more heat. It needed only steadiness. The stockings hung above the hearth, their lines straight and calm. Teresa adjusted one peg minutely, a fraction of movement, so the stocking's toe pointed as she wanted. Then she stepped back, satisfied. She returned to the doorway and looked at the broom one last time. Its bristles rested on the floor, spread slightly, as though it were standing on quiet feet. Teresa reached out and touched the handle again, a small confirmation, then let her hand fall away. She did not move the broom. It was already exactly where it should be. In that moment, she felt a gentle sense of completion, as if the broom's placement had sealed something in the air. The kitchen's order felt solid. It felt ready to hold the night. Teresa breathed in slowly. The scents of the room, clean soap, faint bread, the last whisper of chamomile, combined into something comforting and familiar. She turned back toward the table, toward the counter, toward the sink, and her eyes moved over each surface, noting their tidiness, their readiness. She could sense the next step waiting for her, the slow pattern of wiping and arranging that would continue, but she did not rush toward it. She let the quiet stretch, let the calm deepen. The broom stood by the door, resting in a place of honor, and the night seemed to recognize it, settling around the home with a softer hand. Teresa returned to the table as if it were the heart of the room, and in a quiet way it was. The lamp above it held a steady glow, and the wood beneath her hands seemed to carry the memory of every evening it had witnessed. She opened the drawer where she kept her best wiping cloths, chose one that was soft and clean, and folded it once along the seam as her mother had taught her. The cloth was slightly damp from the rinse she had given it earlier, and it held just enough moisture to gather dust without smearing. Teresa liked it that way. She liked the small readiness of things, the way a cloth could be prepared and waiting, the way a table could be made smooth again, even when it already looked smooth. She began at the far left corner, always the far left corner, and drew the cloth across the surface in a slow arc. The motion was gentle and even, like the sweep of a lullaby. She did not press hard. She let the cloth glide, following a pattern she had repeated so many times that it had become part of her breathing. First a circle, then a straight line along the edge, then another circle that overlapped the first, each one slightly smaller, each one drawing the mind inward toward quiet. The cloth made a soft sound against the wood, a faint whisper that seemed to soothe the room rather than disturb it. Teresa's shoulders stayed relaxed. Her hands moved with calm confidence, as if the pattern itself were guiding her. The table did not need much cleaning. There were no spills. There was no mess. Yet Teresa's wiping was not only about cleanliness. It was about finishing. It was about smoothing away the day's last roughness, even if that roughness was invisible. She had always believed that surfaces held traces of what happened on them, hands resting, cups set down, paper folded, bread covered, sweets wrapped. Those traces were not dirty, but they were present, and wiping the table felt like gathering them gently and letting them go, leaving the wood ready for morning. It was a quiet kind of respect, both for the table and for the life that moved through it. As the cloth traveled, Teresa's mind traveled too, but softly. She remembered her mother's hands, steady and capable, moving in the same slow pattern. Her mother had wiped tables as if she were blessing them, as if she were saying, without words, that this home would be kept kind. Teresa had watched as a child, her chin resting on her palms, feeling the comfort of routine even then. She had not known it was comfort at the time. She had simply felt safe. Now, as an adult, she understood that safety often came from repeated small acts. From the quiet predictability of care, the cloth moved to the center of the table. Teresa's circles widened, then narrowed, tracing a calm geometry. She lifted the biscuit plate briefly, wiped beneath it, then set it down again precisely where it had been. She lifted the sugar tin, wiped beneath, and returned it with its spoon aligned. She touched the empty bowl and shifted it half a finger's width so it sat centered with the rest. Each movement was small, but each one brought a sense of order that felt almost musical. The table was not being decorated. It was being settled, like a bed being smoothed before sleep. Behind her, the broom still rested by the door, and Teresa could see it in the corner of her eye, a quiet vertical line against the pale wall. It seemed to belong to the same language as the wiping cloth, the language of readiness. Teresa thought again briefly of the Befana. She imagined, without effort, an old figure moving through kitchens like hers, not seen, not dramatic, but felt in the way a room grew calmer when it was cared for. The Befana in Teresa's mind was not a stranger. She was a companion to the work of hands. She was present in the steadiness of a cloth moving in circles, in the quiet pride of a clean surface, in the gentle joy of knowing that morning would arrive to a home that had been made welcoming. Teresa's wiping continued, unbroken. She moved toward the near edge of the table, tracing a straight line along the rim, then turning the cloth and tracing another line, as if outlining the table's shape with quiet attention. Her fingers kept the cloth folded neatly, so no frayed corner dragged. She liked the clean fold. She liked how it made the cloth feel purposeful. When the surface was fully wiped, she paused and held the cloth still for a moment, resting it lightly on the wood. The table looked the same as it had a few minutes ago, yet it felt different. It felt calmer, as if the wiping had gathered the room's breath and returned it gently. She folded the cloth again, then wiped the chair backs, each one with a single smooth stroke. The chairs were plain wooden ones, their spindles worn smooth. Teresa's cloth traveled down each back like a gentle hand, removing a faint dust that might not have been there at all, but the gesture pleased her. It made the chairs feel ready, as if someone could sit in them tomorrow morning without any small discomfort. She pushed each chair in neatly, so their legs aligned with the table's legs. The arrangement made the kitchen look composed, like a quiet picture. Teresa returned to the stockings and stood before them. The line of fabric hung steady, the small weight of the sweets creating a soft curve. She did not touch them now. She simply looked, allowing her eyes to rest on the simple sight. The stockings, the table, the covered bread, the broom by the door. Everything in the room spoke the same message. The night was welcomed, the morning was prepared for. There was a quiet confidence in that, a sense that the home could hold whatever came next. Not through force, but through care. She took the cloth to the sink and rinsed it again, squeezing it gently until the water ran clear. The sound of running water was soft, like a small stream. Teresa wrung the cloth carefully, then hung it to dry on its hook, smoothing it so it fell straight. A cloth hung crookedly always bothered her, not because she feared disorder, but because she loved the calm of straight lines. She stepped back and adjusted the cloth by a fraction until it lay flat. Then she turned off the light above the sink, leaving only the lamp over the table casting its pool of warmth. The kitchen now seemed almost ready to sleep. Teresa felt that in the way the air had settled, in the way shadows lay still. Yet she was not finished. There were always small corners, small details, and Teresa's routines moved forward in their gentle sequence. She opened a cupboard door and checked the shelf where she kept her small jars. Everything was in its place. She closed the door and ran her fingertips along the handle, as if confirming it was properly shut. She turned toward the window and listened to the night again. There was little sound now, only the faintest suggestion of the city beyond. It felt as if Rome itself were resting. Teresa returned to the table one more time and placed her palms flat on the surface. She did not press. She simply rested them there, letting the smoothness of the wood reassure her. In that moment, she felt the quiet joy that came from order. It was not an excitement that demanded expression. It was a calm satisfaction, a gentle ease in the chest. She thought of Sophia and Marco again, and of the way their eyes would widen tomorrow at the stockings. She thought of her sister's smile, tired but happy. She thought of the baker downstairs, of his ovens warming the early morning. All these thoughts came and went like soft waves, never crashing, never pulling her out of calm. When she lifted her hands, she noticed a faint mark where her palms had warmed the wood. It faded quickly. Teresa smiled faintly at that, the small evidence of life that disappeared without trouble. She took a deep breath and let it out slowly. The kitchen felt ready for the next gentle task, and Teresa moved toward it with the same steady rhythm, her footsteps soft, her mind quiet, her home held in a calm that seemed almost magical, as though the unseen Befana had already passed through and approved of the smooth, cared-for stillness. With the table wiped and shining softly under the lamp, Teresa's attention drifted naturally toward the places that most people overlooked. The kitchen was small enough that every surface was within reach, yet there were still quiet corners where the day could leave its faint traces. Sugar had a way of traveling, she thought, like a playful child with white shoes, leaving tiny marks behind without meaning any harm. Flour could do the same. Crumbs could hide in the seam between counter and wall, or in the shallow groove where a tile met another tile. Teresa did not mind these small messengers of life. She did not take them as signs of failure. She simply gathered them, gently, as if returning them to silence. She opened a drawer and took out a small brush, one with soft bristles meant for sweeping crumbs from the table without scratching the wood. Its handle was short and polished from use. Teresa held it like a pencil and moved it along the counter's edge, coaxing invisible dust into view. A few pale grains appeared. Sugar, perhaps, from the wrapping she had done earlier, or flour from the breadboard. She watched them collect in a fine line, then swept them into her palm and carried them to the sink, letting them fall into the drain where running water could carry them away. The act was small and simple, yet it seemed to deepen the room's calm, as if every cleared corner made space for the night to settle more comfortably. Teresa moved to the stove next, brushing lightly around the burners where a faint ring of dust always gathered. The stove was clean, but she liked to keep it spotless, not from obsession, but from affection. A clean stove meant warmth was welcome. It meant tea could be made without fuss. It meant morning coffee could begin with ease. She brushed the corners where metal met enamel, then wiped with a damp cloth, following the same slow pattern she had used on the table. Her movements were steady. The cloth traveled in circles, then in straight lines, and the surface seemed to brighten beneath her hand as if grateful. The light above the stove was off, leaving that side of the kitchen in softer shadow. Teresa worked by the lamp's spill, leaning slightly so her shadow fell across the counter like a quiet companion. In the dimmer places, the room felt almost secret. Teresa liked that. It was as though the kitchen had layers, the bright center where the table waited, and the gentler edges where calm could gather. She felt, in those edges, the subtle presence of tradition, the way old stories lived in quiet places. The Befana, she thought, would move through corners more readily than through bright centers. She would appreciate the places where a home was tended without show. Teresa turned toward the pantry shelf, where jars of flour and sugar sat with their lids closed tight. She took down the sugar jar and wiped its base. A faint powder clung there, and she brushed it away with her thumb. The jar's glass caught the light, and for a moment it looked like it held a pale glow inside. Teresa set it back neatly, aligning it with the flour jar beside it. She did the same with the coffee tin, the salt, the small jar of dried herbs. Each object returned to its place as if completing a sentence. She moved to the floor next, where the broom by the door stood like a quiet sentinel. Teresa did not lift it again yet. Instead, she knelt and ran her fingers along the baseboards, feeling for dust. The baseboards were painted white, and in winter, the paint looked slightly warmer under lamplight, like cream. Her fingers found a faint roughness in one corner, where dust gathered from the corridor. She wiped it away with her cloth, then rubbed the paint lightly until it felt smooth. The action was intimate, almost tender, as though she were smoothing a crease in fabric. She rose slowly, her knees stiffening briefly, and returned the cloth to her hand. Teresa's eyes traveled across the kitchen, searching for anything out of place. There was little, yet she noticed how the chair near the wall cast a shadow that made the corner behind it look darker. She moved the chair slightly, just enough to reach behind, and brushed the floor there. A few crumbs appeared, tiny and harmless. She gathered them, wiped the tile, and returned the chair to its position, aligned again with the table. The kitchen seemed to settle back into balance. Teresa felt a quiet satisfaction in this, the satisfaction of small completeness. As she worked, she heard a faint sound from the corridor, perhaps the neighbor's door opening and closing, perhaps someone moving softly. The building was old, and it carried sounds the way it carried warmth, slowly and gently. Teresa did not feel disturbed by this. It reminded her that she was part of a larger living place, surrounded by other kitchens, other lamps, other people settling into their own nights. She imagined other women in other apartments wiping tables, covering bread, setting out cups. She imagined the same quiet traditions repeating up and down the street, like a soft chorus. The thought made her feel less alone, not because she feared solitude, but because community, even unseen, could be comforting. She returned to the counter where she had wrapped the sweets earlier. Even though she had cleaned it, she saw in the lamplight a faint, sparkling line near the edge. Sugar dust. It caught the light like tiny stars. Teresa smiled slightly. Sugar had a stubborn cheerfulness. It refused to hide completely. She dampened her cloth and wiped the line away in one slow stroke. The sparkle vanished, and the counter returned to its smooth, matte calm. She dried the surface with the other side of the cloth so no dampness lingered. She liked leaving surfaces dry. Dampness felt unfinished to her. Dryness felt ready. She opened the window a fraction, not yet for air. She would do that later, more deliberately, but simply to listen. The cold slipped in like a quiet visitor. carrying the faint scent of stone and night. Teresa held the window open for a moment and listened to the city's hush. There was a distant murmur of traffic far away, softened by the winter air, and a faint call of a late passer-by. Then she closed the window again, sealing the warmth back inside. The brief touch of cold made the kitchen's warmth feel even more comforting, as if the room were a small lantern held against the season. Teresa returned to the sink and washed her hands, letting warm water run over her fingers. She dried them carefully, then folded the towel and hung it straight. Her eyes flicked again to the stockings. They hung steady, patient. The wrapped parcels inside were silent. Teresa felt, in the calm of her cleaned corners, a sense that the kitchen was now truly prepared. The corners mattered because they were unseen. They were the places where care was offered without expectation of being noticed. Teresa believed the deepest kindness lived there in the quiet corners of effort. She walked to the hearth and knelt again, checking the stones around it for dust. Her fingers moved along the ledge, and she found a faint, powdery line. Ash from long ago, perhaps, or dust from the street carried in by shoes. She wiped it away, then brushed the edge with her palm. The hearth looked cleaner, and the stockings above it seemed to hang in a more peaceful space. Teresa stood and stepped back, letting her eyes take in the whole arrangement. The hearth stones, the tidy line of stockings, the table's calm setting, the bread's hidden warmth beneath its cloth. Everything seemed to align into a gentle order that felt almost like a lullaby. She thought again of the Befana, and in her mind the old figure did not arrive with a gust of wind. She arrived with quiet approval. She moved through rooms like this one, rooms where sugar dust was wiped from corners, where baseboards were smoothed, where cups were set with care. She left not only sweets and small gifts, but a feeling that the home had been seen, that its steadiness mattered. Teresa did not expect any sign, any sound, yet she felt a softness in the air, as if the kitchen had become more settled than it had been before, as if the work of clearing the corners had made the room breathe more easily. Teresa's pace remained slow and soothing. She did not rush to the next task. She let herself enjoy this stage, the stage where everything seemed complete and the only thing left was to keep it that way. She stood by the table, hands resting lightly on the back of a chair, and took a deep breath. The scents of the kitchen were clean and gentle. The bread's warmth was still there, faint under its cloth. The chamomile lingered lightly. Soap and wood and a hint of sugar blended into something that felt like home. She moved one last time around the room, checking the corners with her eyes rather than her hands. The kitchen looked quiet, tidy, ready. Teresa felt a calm satisfaction settle in her chest, the kind that made sleep later come more easily. She turned toward the window again, and this time she considered the next step she had been postponing, letting a little winter air refresh the room. The thought was not urgent, only part of the evening's gentle sequence. With the corners quiet and the sugar dust gone, the kitchen was prepared for that small breath of night, and Teresa was ready to invite it in. Teresa approached the narrow window with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how much to open it, how long to let the night enter, and when to close it again. The window was old, its frame painted many years before, and now softened at the edges by time and use. The latch was cool under her fingertips. She lifted it gently, careful not to make it clack, and pushed the window inward just a little, no more than the width of her hand. Immediately, the winter air slipped into the kitchen, crisp and clean, carrying with it the faint scent of stone and smoke from distant chimneys. It was not a harsh cold, not sharp enough to bite. It was the kind of cold that felt clarifying, like a cool cloth against a warm forehead. The curtain stirred lightly, and the lamplight trembled across the glass for a moment, then steadied. Teresa stood near the opening and allowed herself to breathe in the fresh air. It tasted of the city at night, of Rome's worn streets and sleeping courtyards, of the Tiber somewhere beyond, dark and patient. She listened too. The sounds outside were few, but each one seemed clearer in the cold. A far-off footstep, the faint rattle of a late bicycle, a door closing gently in another building. Even the silence had texture. It was not emptiness. It was rest. Teresa did not lean out. She did not search the street for movement. She simply let the night be present in the room for a moment, the way one might allow a guest to step inside, remove their coat, and sit quietly. The cold air moved along the floor first, sliding over the tiles like a soft, invisible ribbon. It touched the base of the table, the legs of the chairs, the lower cupboards. Then it rose slowly, mixing with the warmer air above, smoothing the room's temperature into something balanced. Teresa could feel it on her cheeks, on the backs of her hands, and she liked it. It made the kitchen feel freshly awake, as though the room's calm had been rinsed and renewed. Her eyes drifted to the bread covered beneath its clean cloth. She thought of how warmth and cold belonged together in winter, each one making the other more noticeable. The bread's hidden warmth seemed sweeter now that the air was cooler. The stockings, hanging in their tidy line, seemed cozier against the night beyond the glass. The table, wiped and set, looked like a sheltered island in the middle of the season. Teresa felt a quiet gratitude for this simple contrast. It made her home feel like a small lantern, a place where warmth could be held without being taken for granted. She remained by the window long enough for the air to refresh, but not long enough for the room to chill. Teresa was careful with such things. She believed comfort was made not by extremes, but by gentle balance. When she sensed the cold beginning to press too insistently, she reached for the window and drew it closed with the same soft control she had used to open it. The latch clicked into place quietly. The curtain settled. The kitchen's warmth, held by stone walls and steady habits, returned to the forefront. The night was now outside again, but it had left behind a subtle freshness, as if the air inside had been combed smooth. Teresa turned away from the window and crossed the kitchen with unhurried steps. She paused near the table and placed her hand lightly on its surface, feeling the wood's steady warmth. It reassured her. She moved her fingers along the grain, then withdrew her hand. Her gaze traveled again to the stockings. They hung as if nothing had changed, yet Teresa felt that something had shifted in the room's atmosphere. The air seemed clearer. The calm seemed deeper. It was as though the kitchen had taken a slow breath and exhaled whatever heaviness might have gathered unnoticed. In that clearer air, Teresa's thoughts became even softer. She found herself thinking of the children again, not in a way that pulled her into planning or worry, but in a gentle imagining of their morning. Sophia would wake early, perhaps before the sun, her mind already alive with expectation. Marco would wake later, trying to appear casual, but his feet would still hurry toward the hearth. Teresa pictured their faces in the lamplight of her memory, and she felt a warmth in her chest that did not need any outward expression. Her care for them was quiet and steady, like the kitchen's own readiness. She thought, too, of her sister, Lucia, who carried the weight of daily life with a strength that sometimes looked like briskness. Lucia loved her children fiercely, but she moved faster than Teresa, her mind always juggling what needed doing next. Teresa had learned that her own gift was different. She offered stillness. She offered order. She offered a room that could feel like a pause in the middle of the world's demands. Lucia understood this, even if she did not say it often. On nights like this, when tradition softened everyone's edges, Lucia's eyes would linger on Teresa's tidy kitchen with a quiet relief. Teresa moved to the cupboard and took out a small glass, then returned it immediately, deciding she did not need it. She smiled slightly at herself. The impulse had been habit. One more thing to prepare. One more small readiness. Yet she recognized that everything necessary was already in place. There was no need to add more. The kitchen was complete in its simple way. Teresa loved that feeling, the moment when preparation stopped and quiet remained. She walked toward the door where the broom rested. The broom had not moved. It leaned at its gentle angle, bristles touching the floor lightly, handle resting against the wall. Teresa looked at it with the same calm satisfaction she had felt earlier. It seemed almost symbolic now, a quiet reminder that the home was kept clean and ready. She imagined, for a fleeting moment, the Befana passing through the corridor, unseen, pausing by the broom as if acknowledging it. The thought did not frighten her. It did not feel strange. It felt comforting, like imagining an old friend nodding in approval. The night air that had entered through the window seemed to have sharpened the room's scents. Teresa could smell the bread more clearly beneath its cloth, the faint sweetness of sugar that had once been dusted on the counter, the clean soapiness of the cloths she had folded. These scents were gentle, familiar. They wrapped around her like a quiet blanket. She breathed them in and felt her shoulders loosen even further. As if her body recognized it was safe to rest, Teresa returned to the table and sat, letting the chair take her weight. She did not pick up a cup now. She simply sat and listened to the room. The silence had changed after the window was opened and closed. It felt fresher, lighter. The building's faint sounds continued, pipes settling, perhaps a distant step, but they seemed farther away, softened by the renewed air. The lamp's light was steady, and the shadows were calm. The stockings hung quietly, the bread rested, the table waited. Everything was in place. She sat this way for several minutes, allowing the calm to deepen. Teresa's mind did not wander far. It stayed close to the room, noticing small details, the way the curtain fell in a gentle curve, the way the spoon handles on the saucers pointed outward like polite invitations, the way the stove's enamel looked smooth in the dim. These observations were soothing. They required no effort. They were simply the mind resting on what was gentle and orderly. At last, Teresa rose. The air in the kitchen now felt perfectly balanced, warm enough to comfort, fresh enough to feel clean. The winter outside remained at the window, but it had been acknowledged, welcomed briefly, and then kept at a respectful distance. Teresa felt ready for the next step, the one that would carry the calm beyond the kitchen into the rest of the apartment. She looked once more at the room she had prepared, and in that clear, refreshed air, she sensed again that quiet presence she never named aloud. The Befana was still unseen, still only felt, but the feeling was stronger now. A soft approval, a gentle companionship in the order Teresa had made. With that calm assurance, she moved forward, her footsteps soft, as the night continued to settle and the home grew even more ready for morning. The refreshed air in the kitchen seemed to follow Teresa as she stepped into the corridor, as if the calm she had shaped in one room wished to spread through the rest of the apartment. The hallway was narrow, lined with pale walls and a few framed prints that had faded slightly with time. Teresa's footsteps were quiet on the worn runner rug, and the light from the kitchen lamp reached only part way, leaving the far end of the corridor in a soft dimness. She did not turn on another lamp. She liked the gentle gradation from light to shadow, the way it made the apartment feel as though it were gradually settling into sleep. She paused at the first doorway and looked into the small sitting room. It was a simple space, a sofa covered with a neat throw, a low table with a stack of newspapers that Teresa had already straightened earlier, and a small cabinet where she kept a few cherished things: letters tied with ribbon, a photograph of her parents, a tiny porcelain figurine of a dove. Teresa did not enter fully. She stood at the threshold and let her eyes move over the room, noticing the way the throw lay, the way the cushions sat. With one small adjustment, she smoothed the edge of the throw so it fell evenly over the sofa's arm. The motion was slow and light, like smoothing a crease in water. This was how the house learned order, Teresa thought, not through strict rules, but through gentle, repeated touch. A room did not become calm by being commanded into calmness. It became calm by being tended, by being returned again and again to its quiet shape. Teresa moved from one room to the next, as if she were carrying a soft brush, not only dusting surfaces, but brushing the air itself into something smoother. In the bedroom, she straightened the coverlet at the foot of the bed, pulling it so the seam lay straight. She aligned the slippers beside the bed, toes forward, ready for the morning. She did not do this because she feared disorder. She did it because she liked waking to a room that offered ease. At the dresser, she picked up a small brush and placed it in its dish, then set the dish back where it belonged. The action took only seconds, yet it seemed to settle the space. Teresa opened a drawer and checked that her nightclothes were folded neatly. They were. She closed the drawer and pressed her palm to its front for a moment, as if sealing the quiet inside. The bedroom smelled faintly of lavender, a sachet tucked among linens, and the scent was soft and steady. Teresa breathed it in and felt her chest loosen further, as if her body recognized that the night was becoming safe and complete. She returned to the corridor and moved toward the small washroom. The tiles there were cool beneath her feet, and she reached for a cloth hanging beside the sink. She wiped the edge of the basin where water sometimes left a faint line, then dried it, leaving the porcelain clean and ready. She turned the faucet briefly, just to ensure it was fully closed, then placed the soap neatly on its dish. The mirror above the sink was clear. Teresa wiped its lower edge anyway, where steam sometimes clung, then stepped back and let it reflect the dim corridor light like a calm pool. As she moved through these spaces, Teresa felt the apartment's mood shift, becoming more unified. The kitchen's readiness, stockings hung, sweets wrapped, bread covered, seemed to influence everything else. The sitting room felt more orderly because the kitchen was orderly. The bedroom felt more restful because the sitting room was calm. The apartment became a chain of gentle preparations, each room supporting the next, each small adjustment contributing to a larger sense of ease. Teresa liked this. It made her feel as if the house itself were participating, as if the walls and furniture had learned the language of quiet. She returned to the kitchen and paused in the doorway. The room looked unchanged, yet it felt even more settled now, as though it had been given time to absorb the fresh air and the careful wiping, and to rest in its own readiness. Teresa's eyes moved again to the stockings. They hung patiently, their slight weight giving them a soft, living curve. She thought of the children's hands, reaching, searching, finding. She imagined their delight, small and bright. But she also imagined something quieter, the way the house would greet them in the morning with its calm order. The table would be clean. The bread would be warm beneath its cloth. The cups would be easy to find. The morning would begin without scrambling. That too was a gift. Teresa walked to the counter and checked the placement of the breadboard. The cloth still covered the loaf snugly. She adjusted one edge so it tucked in neatly, then stepped back. She glanced at the kettle, now cold enough to touch comfortably, and returned it to the stove so the trivet could be cleared. The action was small, but it mattered to her. A clear counter, an uncluttered table, a stove ready for morning. They were all part of the same gentle order. Teresa believed that tomorrow's comfort could be built tonight, one careful step at a time. She moved to the table and set out one more thing, a small dish with a single spoon resting inside it, ready for jam. The dish was white, simple, and she placed it near the breadboard's edge as if it belonged there. She imagined Sophia dipping bread into jam with delighted seriousness, and Marco pretending he did not care. The dish made the morning feel nearer, not in a demanding way, but in a comforting one. It suggested continuity. It suggested that the night's quiet care would carry forward. Teresa looked around the kitchen again, and something in her expression softened. It was not a smile that asked to be seen. It was the quiet release of satisfaction. The room was ready. Yet more than the room, the entire apartment now felt ready. It felt as though the house had been taught, gently, how to hold itself through the night. Teresa's routines, repeated over years, had shaped the home into something that could cradle the mind. Even the shadows seemed arranged, falling in places that felt natural. The air, freshened by the window, was clean and calm. In that stillness, Teresa felt the Befana again, not as an image, but as a subtle presence woven through preparation. It was in the way the broom stood by the door, angled just right. It was in the way the table had been wiped in its slow pattern. It was in the way the bread rested under its clean cloth. Teresa did not need to see anything. The sense of being accompanied by tradition, by the quiet spirit of kindness, was enough. It was like feeling the warmth of a nearby fire without needing to look at the flame. She turned off the kitchen lamp for a moment, then paused, reconsidered, and turned it on again. Not yet. She wanted a little more light to finish the last small tasks. She opened a cupboard and checked the cups one last time, ensuring they were stacked neatly. She checked the drawer where she kept her cloths. Everything was in order. She closed the cupboard, then the drawer, each click soft, each closure a gentle punctuation. Her movements were unhurried, as if she were writing the night's final sentences with her hands. Teresa stepped into the corridor again and looked down its length. The apartment felt quiet and ready. She could almost sense the morning waiting somewhere beyond the shutters, not yet present, but already anticipated. She imagined the sun catching the city's roofs, the bakers' ovens glowing downstairs, the first sounds of the street returning. When those sounds came, her home would be prepared to meet them calmly. That was what she wanted. Not perfection, but ease. Not spectacle, but steadiness. She returned to the kitchen and stood still in the center of the room, letting herself feel the gentle order she had created. The house had learned it, room by room, surface by surface. It now held that order without effort, as if it belonged naturally. Teresa breathed in slowly, then out, and the act felt like a final smoothing, an internal wiping of the mind. The stockings hung quietly, the bread rested, the table waited, the broom stood by the door, the air was fresh, the apartment was ready to be tucked in. And Teresa, having taught the house its gentle order once more, felt ready to move toward the last quiet steps of the night. When Teresa finally decided it was time to close the shutters, the choice felt less like an action and more like a gentle turning of a page. The kitchen had been refreshed, arranged, and taught its quiet order again, and the apartment beyond it lay calm and dim. The lamp over the table still burned, but its light seemed softer now, as if it too understood that the night was deepening. Teresa stood for a moment in the center of the kitchen, letting her eyes travel over everything one last time. The stockings hung in their tidy line. The bread rested under its clean cloth. The broom stood by the door, and the table waited in composed stillness. There was nothing more to add. There was only the last small act of drawing a boundary between the home's warmth and the winter's quiet outside. She crossed to the window and placed her hand on the shutter's inner latch. The wood was cool and slightly rough, painted long ago in a pale color that had softened with age. Teresa had always liked shutters. Curtains felt like fabric promises, gentle and flowing, but shutters felt like protection, like a solid hand closing over the night without fear. She released the latch and pulled the first shutter inward. It moved with a faint creak, not loud, but old enough to speak. Teresa did not mind. The sound was part of the house's voice, familiar and honest. She guided the shutter carefully until it met its pair, and then she fastened them together so they sat snugly, leaving only the thinnest seam of darkness between their edges. The room changed at once, though not abruptly. The streetlight that had filtered through the glass and curtain was gone, and the kitchen became more enclosed, more intimate. The lamp's light gathered inward, no longer competing with the outside. Shadows grew softer, less stretched. The air felt warmer, as if the cold had been politely asked to remain beyond the wooden barrier. Teresa stood still for a moment, feeling the shift. She liked the sensation of shutters closing, because it always made her feel as though the home had been tucked in, like a child under blankets. She moved to the sitting room next, where another window faced the street. Here the shutters were heavier, and the latch required a firmer hand. Teresa opened the curtain slightly, just enough to reach the wood, and for a brief moment, she saw the street below. It was quiet now, the cobblestones gleaming faintly under lamplight, the doorway of the baker's shop dark. A cat moved along the wall and vanished into shadow. Teresa watched without lingering, then began closing the shutters. They folded inward with a muted sound, and when they met, the room dimmed into a gentle hush. She fastened the latch, then smoothed the curtain back into place, letting it fall evenly. The sitting room felt immediately more restful, as if it had been invited to sleep. Teresa moved along the corridor to the bedroom and repeated the same calm ritual. The shutters there were smaller, and the window looked out onto a quiet courtyard where laundry lines hung empty in winter. She closed the shutters slowly, feeling the wood's coolness under her fingertips. When she latched them, the bedroom grew dim, and the faint scent of lavender seemed stronger in the softer light. Teresa did not turn on a lamp there. She left the bedroom in shadow, ready and waiting, like a bed with its covers smoothed. Returning to the kitchen, she found that the room's quiet had deepened. With shutters closed, the apartment seemed to belong entirely to itself, held inside its own calm boundaries. The outside world continued, but it felt far away, muffled. Teresa turned down the lamp slightly, adjusting the wick so the flame became smaller. The light softened, pooling more gently on the table, leaving the corners in warm shadow. In this dimmer glow, the stockings seemed to blend more into the hearthstone, like sleeping things at rest. The bread under its cloth looked like a small mound of warmth hidden from view. Even the broom by the door seemed quieter, its handle casting a slim shadow along the wall. Teresa walked to the table and straightened one spoon, though it hardly needed it. She ran her hand lightly along the table's edge, feeling the smoothness she had created. Then She lifted the biscuit plate and placed it back in the cupboard. She did not want biscuits sitting out overnight, growing stale. She preferred to keep the table uncluttered now, so the morning would arrive to a clear surface ready for fresh bread. The sugar tin was returned to its shelf as well, and the empty bowl placed neatly beside it. Teresa moved each item with deliberate quiet, not wanting to disturb the settled feeling of the room. The kitchen felt like a lullaby already half sung. She did not want to add a sharp note. She left the bread covered, of course. The cloth lay smooth, its edges tucked. The loaf's warmth was less now, but still faintly present, held gently by the linen. Teresa's hand hovered over it for a moment, as if checking its comfort the way one might check a sleeping child's blanket. Then she withdrew. The stockings, too, she left untouched. Their secrets were placed. Their line was tidy. Nothing needed changing. Teresa's care had done its work, and now the work was to let the home rest. She washed her hands one final time, not because they were dirty, but because she liked ending the evening with the feeling of clean skin. The warm water ran softly. She dried her hands and hung the towel straight. Then she stood by the sink and listened. The apartment was quiet in a deeper way now, with the shutters closed, as if the walls had thickened. She could hear her own breath. She could hear the faint settling of the building. Nothing else demanded attention. Teresa returned to the center of the kitchen and looked around slowly. She felt something tender in her chest, a calm satisfaction that did not seek words. The room was ready for morning, yes, but it was also ready for night. It held no clutter, no sharpness, no unfinished tasks. It held the gentle traces of preparation, which to Teresa felt like the softest kind of magic. The Befana remained unseen, yet the sense of her presence felt clearer now, not as a figure, but as an atmosphere. The quiet joy of order, the warmth of thoughtful routines, the tender expectation that morning would bring small delights. Teresa moved toward the corridor and paused beside the broom by the door. She did not touch it. She simply glanced at it, acknowledging its place, then stepped past it. The corridor was dim now, the kitchen lamp casting only a weak glow beyond the doorway. Teresa walked slowly, her slippers whispering against the rug. She reached the bedroom and stood at the threshold, looking back down the corridor. The apartment felt like a series of small, calm rooms held together by the same gentle care. It felt safe. It felt complete. She entered the bedroom and closed the door partway, leaving it ajar, just enough that the kitchen's faint light could reach the corridor, just enough that the apartment still felt connected. Teresa sat at the edge of the bed and removed her slippers, placing them neatly side by side. She smoothed the coverlet one last time with the flat of her hand, then lay down slowly, as if not wanting to disturb the quiet she had built. The lavender scent rose around her, soft and steady. The shutters were closed. The night was held outside. The home was settled. In the kitchen, the stockings hung in their tidy line. The bread rested beneath its clean cloth. The table waited clear and smooth. The broom stood by the door. Everything was ready, and in that readiness the night seemed to soften, wrapping the apartment in a calm that felt almost like a blessing. Teresa closed her eyes and let the darkness feel gentle, trusting that the unseen kindness of tradition and the quiet care she had woven through her home would hold through the hours until morning. The apartment held its darkness the way a well-made bed held warmth, not empty, not cold, but softly contained. With the shutters closed, the night outside became distant, reduced to a faint pressure against wood and glass. a quiet reminder that winter still existed beyond the safe boundaries of the rooms Teresa had prepared. Inside, the air remained calm and balanced, neither too warm nor too cool, as if the home had found its own steady temperature through the simple wisdom of care. Teresa lay in her bed with her eyes closed, breathing slowly, and the scent of lavender seemed to settle around her like a thin veil. She did not chase sleep. She let it come in its own time, trusting the same gentle order she had woven into the kitchen. In the corridor, shadows rested without movement. The sitting room remained tidy, its throw smoothed, its papers stacked. The kitchen, at the heart of the apartment, waited in quiet readiness. Even in darkness, it seemed to hold its shape. The table was clear and smooth. The bread rested under its clean cloth, keeping what little warmth it still had, a hidden comfort saved for morning. The stockings hung in their tidy line above the hearth, each one holding a few wrapped parcels tied with twine. The broom stood by the door at its precise angle, neither in the way nor forgotten, a simple guardian of cleanliness and calm. There were no dramatic signs, no sudden stirrings, yet the sense of tradition, the subtle presence Teresa never needed to name aloud, seemed to sit gently in the air, as if approving of the quiet. Teresa's thoughts drifted, not in sharp lines, but in soft loops. She remembered Sophia's small fingers, sticky with jam in the mornings, and Marco's careful attempt to appear grown, even as his eyes betrayed his curiosity. She thought of Lucia, her sister, tired and devoted, and of the way Lucia's shoulders always softened when she stepped into Teresa's kitchen. It was as though the room offered a pause, a place where life could slow down. Teresa felt no need to solve anything tonight. She had done what she could do. She had prepared. She had tidied. She had created a gentle harbor for morning. That was enough. In the same way she had folded cloth and tied twine, she now folded her thoughts into calm shapes and let them rest. Somewhere below, in the baker's shop, the ovens were dark for the moment, but Teresa knew they would wake long before dawn. She imagined the first quiet movements of the baker, the way he would shape dough in the half-light, his hands working steadily, almost silently, as if he too were following an old pattern. The thought pleased her. It made her feel connected to the world in a comforting way. While she slept, other hands would work. While she rested, warmth would be prepared. Morning was always being built, even in the dark. It waited patiently, like bread beneath a cloth. Teresa's breathing grew deeper. Her body began to soften into the mattress, and the room's darkness became less a thing to see and more a thing to feel. Soft, steady, protective. She listened, faintly, for any sound. There was only the building's quiet settling, the distant, almost inaudible murmur of the city far away, and her own slow breath. She did not need more. Her mind began to slip towards sleep, the way a boat slips towards still water, without struggle, guided by familiarity and calm. In the kitchen, time continued without announcement. The stockings did not move. The wrapped sweets remained tucked in their paper, the twine knots holding firm. The bread did not cool completely. It held its quiet presence. The table's smooth surface waited, ready to receive cups again in the morning. It was as if the room itself were keeping watch, holding the preparations in place so that Teresa did not need to. In that sense, the home truly had learned gentle order. It could remain ready on its own, like a lullaby that continued after the singer fell asleep. If the Befana passed through the night, she did so as she always did in Teresa's mind, without spectacle. Perhaps it was only a story, perhaps only a tradition carried in the blood and in the hands. Yet traditions had their own kind of reality, one that lived in the way people prepared, the way they hoped, the way they offered small comforts to children and to one another. The Befana's presence, whether imagined or real, was felt in the steadiness of the kitchen's calm. It was felt in the neat line of stockings, in the clean corners, in the broom by the door. It was felt in the quiet joy that came from knowing that someone, somewhere, was being thought of kindly. The hours moved on. Outside, the night air remained cold, pressing against shutters and stone. But inside the apartment, warmth held steady. Teresa turned slightly in her sleep, her hand resting on the coverlet, her face relaxed. The lavender scent remained, gentle and faithful. In her dreams, if she dreamed, perhaps she walked through a kitchen that glowed softly. Perhaps she followed a path of lamplight across cobblestones. Perhaps she heard the kettle's first whisper again. Her dreams, like her waking life, would be shaped by quiet repetitions, by small comforts that asked nothing and offered peace. Toward the edge of dawn, the darkness shifted almost imperceptibly. Even behind shutters, there was a change in the air, a faint easing, as if the world were beginning to turn its face toward light. The apartment remained dim, but the sense of morning waiting grew stronger, like a gentle tide rising. The baker downstairs would soon light his ovens. In the street, a few early footsteps would begin to sound. Somewhere in Lucia's apartment, Sophia might stir, her body sensing the day before her mind fully woke. Marco might roll over, still holding on to sleep, but already drifting toward the thought of the stockings. Teresa's home waited for them without impatience. It waited with calm certainty. The kitchen was ready for morning, not with an eagerness that demanded it come quickly, but with a quiet trust that it would arrive in its time. The table would welcome cups again. The bread would be uncovered, its scent rising fresh. The stockings would be found, their small parcels discovered with delighted hands. The room would fill with soft voices, with laughter, with the gentle bustle of waking. And yet even then, the order Teresa had built would remain. It would cradle the morning, keeping it from becoming frantic, holding it steady and kind. In the last deep stretch of night, Teresa slept peacefully. Her apartment held its calm around her, and nothing in it felt unfinished. The shutters were closed. The corridor was quiet. The sitting room was tidy. The kitchen was prepared. The sense of the Befana, unseen, only felt, seemed to rest like a soft blessing over the home, not as a presence to be feared or even watched, but as a gentle assurance that care was noticed, that tradition lived, that small kindnesses mattered. And so the night passed in softness. Morning waited in the dark, patient and near. The home, ready and whole, held its quiet gifts close. May your own night be held just as gently, and may sleep come to you like warm bread beneath a clean cloth, slow, comforting, and deep, carrying you safely into a peaceful dawn.